Hey everyone, this is Allison from Allykatkreations. How are you? I've got my sidekick again over here. Miss Morgan. We're getting there. We're getting there. I hope all of you are doing okay. If you so humbly will do so to help me out, hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel. I do lots of things. I'm working on a really fascinating topic about aliens. It's almost there. And share if this is something that other people around you might be interested in. Save wavelength. So today I'm going to read Inorganic Awareness. This is Carlos Castaneda, The Active Side of Infinity. We're going through the process of the dark night of the soul and the awareness within. At a given moment in my apprenticeship, Don Juan revealed to me the complexity of his life situation. He had maintained to my chagrin and despondency that he had lived in a shack in the state of Sonora, Mexico, because that shack depicted my state of awareness. I didn't quite believe that he really meant that I was so meager, nor did I believe that he had other places to live as he was claiming. It turned out that he was right on both accounts. My state of awareness was very meager, and he did have other places where he could live. Infinitely more comfortable than the shack where I had first found him. Not was he the solitary sorcerer that I had thought him to be, but the leader of a group of 15 other warrior travelers, 10 women and 5 men. My surprise was gigantic when he took me to his house in central Mexico, where he and his companion sorcerers lived. Did you live in Sonora just because of me, Don Juan? I asked him, unable to stand with the responsibility, with which filled me with guilt and remorse and a sensation of worthlessness. Well, I didn't actually live there, he said, laughing. I just met you there. But you never knew when I was coming to see you, Don Juan. I said, I had no means to let you know. Well, if you remember correctly, he said, there were many, many times when you didn't find me. You had to sit patiently and wait for me for days sometimes. Did you fly here to Guamas, Don Juan? I asked him in earnest. I thought the shortest way would have been to be taking a plane. No, I didn't fly to Guamas, he said with a big smile. I flew directly to the shack where you were waiting. I knew that he was purposefully telling me something that my linear mind could not understand or accept, something that was confusing me no end. I was at the level of awareness in those days when I asked myself insistently a fatal question. What if all that Don Juan says is true? I didn't want to ask him any more questions because I was hopelessly lost, trying to bridge our 2 tracks of thought and action. In his new surroundings, Don Juan began painstakingly to instruct me in more complex facet of his knowledge, a facet that required all my attention, a facet in which merely suspended judgment was not enough. This was the time I had to plummet down into the depths of his knowledge. I had to cease to be objective, and at the same time, I had to desist from being subjugative. One day, I was helping Don Juan clean some bamboo poles in the back of his house. He asked me to put on some working gloves because he said the splinters of bamboo were very sharp and easily caused infections. He directed me on how to use a knife to clean the bamboo. I became immersed in the work. When Don Juan began to talk to me, I had to stop working in order to pay attention. He told me that I had worked long enough and that we should go into the house. He asked me to sit down in a comfortable armchair in his spacious, almost empty living room. He gave me some nuts, dried apricots, and slices of cheese neatly arranged on a plate. I protested that I wanted to finish cleaning the bamboo. I didn't want to eat, but he didn't pay attention to me. He recommended that I nibble slowly and carefully, for I would need a steady supply of food in order to be alert and attentive to what he was going to tell me. You already knew, he began, that there exists in the universe a perennial force, which the sorcerers of ancient Mexico called the dark sea of awareness. While they were at the maximum of their perceiving power, they saw something that made them shake in their pantalones. This is so silly words that people use. If they were wearing any. They saw the dark sea of awareness is responsible not only for the awareness of organisms, but also for the awareness of entities that didn't have an organism. What is this, Don Juan begins, without an organism that have awareness? I asked, astonished, for he had never mentioned such an idea before. The old shamans discovered the entire universe is composed of twin forces, he began. Forces that are at the same time opposed and complementary to each other. It is inescapable that our world is a twin world. Its opposite and complementary world is one populated by beings that have awareness, but not all organisms. For this reason, the old shamans called them inorganic beings. And where is this world, Don Juan? I asked, munching unconsciously on a piece of dry apricot. Here, where you are, and I am sitting, he replied matter-of-factly, but laughing outright with my nervousness. I told you that it's our twin world, so it's intimately related to us. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico didn't think like you did in terms of space and time. They thought exclusively in terms of awareness. Two types of awareness coexist without ever impinging on each other because each type is entirely different from the other. The old shamans faced the problem of coexistence without concerning themselves with time and space. They reasoned that the degree of awareness of organic beings and the degree of awareness of inorganic beings were so different that both could coexist with the most minimal interference. Can we perceive those inorganic beings, Don Juan? I asked. We certainly can, he replied. Sorcerers do it at will. Average people do it, but they don't realize that they're doing it because they are not conscious of the existence of a twin world. When they think of a twin world, they enter into all kinds of mental masturbation, but it has never occurred to them that their fantasies have their origin in a subliminal knowledge that all of us have, that we're not alone. I was riveted by Don Juan's words. Suddenly, I had become vicariously hungry. There was an emptiness in the pit of my stomach. All I could do was listen as carefully as I could and eat. The difficulty with you facing things in terms of time and space, he continued, is that you only notice if something has landed in the space and time at your disposal, which is very limited. Sorcerers, on the other hand, have a vast field on which they can notice if something extraneous has landed. Lots of entities from the universe at large, entities that possess awareness but not an organism, land in the field of awareness of our world, or the field of awareness of its twin world, without an average human being ever noticing them. The entities that land on our field of awareness or the field of awareness of our twin world belong to other worlds that exist besides our world and its twin. The universe at large is crammed to the brim with worlds of awareness, organic and inorganic. Don Juan continued talking and said that those sorcerers knew when inorganic awareness from other worlds besides our twin world had landed in their field of awareness. He said that as every human being on this earth would do, those shamans made endless classifications of different types of the energy that has awareness. They knew them by general term inorganic beings. Did those inorganic beings have life like we have life? I asked. If you think that life is to be aware, then they do have life, he said. I suppose it would be accurate to say that if life can be measured by intensely the sharpness, the duration of that awareness, I can sincerely say that they are more alive than you and I. Do those inorganic beings die, Don Juan? I asked. Don Juan chuckled for a moment before he answered. If you call death the termination of awareness, yes, they die. Their awareness ends. Their death is rather like the death of a human being, and at the same time, it isn't, because the death of a human being has a hidden option. It is something like a clause in a legal document, a clause that is written in tiny letters that you can barely see. You have to use a magnifying glass to read it, and yet it's the most important clause of the document. What's the hidden option, Don Juan? Death's hidden option is exclusively for sorcerers. They are the only ones who have, to my knowledge, read the fine print. For them, the option is permanent and functional. For average human beings, death means the termination of their awareness, the end of their organisms. For the inorganic beings, death means the end, the end of their awareness. In both cases, the impact of death is the act of being sucked into the dark sea of awareness. Their individual awareness, loaded with their life experiences, breaks into boundaries, and awareness as energy spills out into the dark sea of awareness. But what is death's hidden option that is picked up only by sorcerers, Don Juan, I asked. For a sorcerer, death is a unifying factor. Instead of disintegrating the organism, as ordinarily the case, death unifies it. How can death unify anything? I protested. Death for a sorcerer, he said, terminates the reins of individual moods in the body. The old sorcerers believed it was the dominion of different parts of the body that ruled the moods and actions of total body. Parts that became dysfunctional dragged the rest of the body to chaos, such as, for instance, when you yourself get sick from eating junk. In that case, the mood of your stomach affects everything else. Death eradicates the dominion of those individual parts. It unifies their awareness into one single unit. Do you mean that after they die, sorcerers are still aware? I asked. For sorcerers, death is an act of unification that employs every bit of their energy. You are thinking of death as a corpse in front of you, a body on which decay has settled. For sorcerers, when the act of unification takes place, there is no corpse. There is no decay. Their bodies, in their entirety, have been turned into energy, energy possessing awareness that is not fragmented. The boundaries that are set up by the organism, boundaries which are broken down by death, are still functioning in the case of sorcerers, although they are no longer visible to the naked eye. I know that you are dying to ask me, he continued with a broad smile, if whatever I'm describing is the soul that goes to heaven, hell or heaven. No, it's not the soul. What happens to sorcerers when they pick up the hidden option of death is that they turn into inorganic beings, very specialized, high-speed inorganic beings, beings capable of stupendous maneuvers of perception. Sorcerers enter then into what the shamans of ancient Mexico called their definitive journey. Infinity becomes their realm of action. Do you mean by this, Don Juan, that they become eternal? My sobriety as a sorcerer tells me, he said, that their awareness will terminate the way inorganic beings' awareness terminates. But I haven't seen this happen. I have no firsthand knowledge of it. The old sorcerers believed that the awareness of this type of inorganic being would last as long as the earth is alive. The earth is their matrix. As long as it prevails, their awareness continues. To me, this is the most reasonable statement. The continuity and order of Don Juan's explanation had been, for me, superb. I had no way of whatsoever in which to contribute. He left me with a sensation of mystery and unvoiced expectations to be fulfilled. On my next visit to Don Juan, I began my conversation by asking him eagerly a question that was foremost in my mind. Is there a possibility, Don Juan, that ghosts and apparitions exist? Whatever you may call a ghost or an apparition, he said, when it is scrutinized by a sorcerer, boils down to one issue. It is possible that any of these ghost-like apparitions may be a conglomerate of energy fields that have awareness, in which we turn into things we know. If that's the case, then the apparitions have energy. Sorcerers call them energy generating configurations, or no energy emanates from them. It will case they are phantasmical creations, usually of a very strong person, strong in terms of awareness. One story that intrigued me immensely, Don Juan continued, was the story you told me once about your aunt. Do you remember it? I had told Don Juan when I was 14 years old, I had gone to live in my father's sister's house. She lived in a gigantic house that had 3 patios with living accommodations in between each of them, bedrooms, living rooms. The first patio was austere cobblestone. They told me that it was a colonial house, and this first patio was horse-drawn carriages had gone in. The second patio was a beautiful orchard zigzagged by brick lanes of Moorish design and filled with fruit trees. The third patio was covered with flower pots hanging from the eaves of the roof, birds in cages, and colonial-style foundation in the middle of it with running water, as well as a large area fenced with chicken wire set aside for my aunt's prize fighting cocks, her predilection in life. My aunt made available to me a whole apartment right in front of the fruit orchard. I thought I was going to have the time of my life there. I could eat all the fruit that I wanted. No one else in the household touched the fruit of any of those trees for reasons that were never revealed to me. The household was composed of my aunt, a tall, round-faced, chubby lady in her 50s, very jovial, a great rancor, and full of eccentricities that she had hid behind a formal facade and the appearance of devout Catholicism. There was a butler, a tall, imposing man in his early 40s who had been a sergeant major in the army and had been lured out of the service to occupy the better paid position of butler, bodyguard, and all-around man in my aunt's house. His wife, a beautiful young woman, was my aunt's companion, cook, and confidant. The couple had a daughter, a chubby little girl who looked exactly like my aunt. The likeness was so strange that my aunt had adopted her legally. Those 4 were the quietest people I had ever met. They lived a very sedate life, punctuated only by the eccentricities of my aunt, who on the spur of the moment would decide to take trips or buy promising new cockfighting, train them, and actually have serious contests in which enormous sums of money were involved. She tended her cockfights with loving care, sometimes all day. She wore thick leather gloves and stiff leather leggings to keep the fighting cocks from spurring her. I spent 2 stupendous months living in my aunt's house. She taught me music in the afternoons and told me endless stories about my family's ancestors. My living situation was ideal for me because I used to go out with my friends and didn't have to report the time I came back to anybody. Sometimes I used to spend hours without falling asleep, lying on my bed. I used to keep my window open to let the smell of orange blossoms fill my room. Whenever I was lying there awake, I would hear someone walking down a long corridor that ran the length of the whole property on the north side, joining all the patios of the house. This corridor had beautiful arches and tiled floor. There were light bulbs and minimal voltage that dimly illuminated the corridor. Lights that were turned on at 6 o'clock every evening and turned off about 6 in the morning. I asked my aunt if anyone walked at night and stopped at my window because whoever was walking always stopped by my window, turned around and walked back again toward the main entrance of the house. Don't trouble yourself with that nonsense, dear, my aunt said, smiling. It's probably my butler making the rounds. Big deal. You're not frightened. No, I wasn't frightened, I said. I just got curious because your butler walks up to my window, to my room every night. Sometimes his steps wake me up. She discarded my inquiry in a matter-of-fact fashion, saying that the butler had been a military man and was habituated to making his rounds as a sentry would. I accepted her explanation. One day I mentioned to the butler that his steps were just too loud and asked if he would make his rounds by my window with a little more care as to let me sleep. I don't know what you're talking about, he said in a gruff voice. My aunt told me that you make rounds at night. I said, I never do such a thing, he said, his eyes flaring with disgust. But who walks by my window then? Nobody walks by your window. You're imagining things. Just go back to sleep. Don't go around stirring things up. I'm telling you this for your own good. Nothing could have been worse for me in those years than someone telling me that they were doing something for my own good. That night, as soon as I began to hear the footsteps, I got out of my bed and stood behind the wall that led to the entrance of my apartment. Then I calculated that whoever was walking was by the second bulb. I struck my head out to look around the corridor. The steps stopped abruptly, but there was no one in sight. The dimly illuminated corridor was deserted. If somebody had been walking there, they wouldn't have had time to hide because there was no place to hide. There were only bare walls. My fright was so immense that I woke up the whole household screaming my head off. My aunt and her butler tried to calm me down by telling me that I was imagining all of that, but my agitation was so intense that both of them sheepishly confessed in the end that something which was unknown to them walked in that house every night. Don Juan had said that it was almost surely my aunt who walked at night. That is to say, some aspect of her awareness over which she had no volition control. He believed that this phenomenon obeyed a sense of playfulness or mystery that she cultivated. Don Juan was sure that it was not a far-fetched idea that my aunt, at a subliminal level, was not only making all those noises happen, but that she was capable of much more complex manipulations of awareness. Don Juan had also said, to be completely fair, he had to omit the possibility that the steps were the product of inorganic awareness. Don Juan said that inorganic beings who populated our twin world were considered by the sorcerers of his lineage to be our relatives. Those shamans believed that it was fruitful to make friends with our family members because the demands levied on us for such friendships were always exorbitant. He said that the type of inorganic being who our first cousins communicate with us incessantly, but that their communication with us is not at the level of conscious awareness. In other words, we know all about them in a subliminal way, while they know all about us in a deliberate, conscious manner. The energy from our first cousin is a drag, Don Juan went on. They are as up as we are. Let's say that the organic and inorganic beings of our twin worlds are the children of two sisters who live next door to each other. They're exactly alike. They look different. They cannot help us, and we cannot help them. Perhaps we can join together and make a fabulous family business corporation, but that hasn't happened. Both branches of the family are extremely touchy and take offense over nothing, a typical relationship between touchy first cousins. The crux of the matter, the sorcerers of ancient Mexico believed, is that both human beings and inorganic beings from the twin worlds are profound egomaniacs. According to Don Juan, another classification that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico made of inorganic beings was that of scouts or explorers. By this, they meant inorganic beings that came from the depths of the universe and which were possessors of awareness, infinitely sharper and faster than that of a human being. Don Juan asserted that the old sorcerers had spent generations polishing their classification schemes and their conclusions that were certain types of inorganic beings from the category of scouts or explorers, because of their vicariousness, were akin to man. They could make legions and establish a symbiotic relation with man. The old sorcerers called these kinds of inorganic beings the allies. Don Juan explained the crucial mistake of those shamans with reference to type of inorganic beings was the attribute human characteristics to that impersonal energy and to believe that they could have harnessed it. They thought of those blocks of energy as their helpers, and they relied on them without comprehending that, being pure energy, they didn't have the power to sustain any effort. I've told you all there is to know about inorganic beings, Don Juan said abruptly. The only way you can put this to test is by means of direct experience. I didn't ask him what he wanted me to do. A deep fear made my body rattle with nervous spasms that bursted like a volcanic eruption from my solar plexus and extended down to the tips of my toes and up to my upper trunk. Today we will go to look for some inorganic beings, he announced. Don Juan ordered me to sit on my bed and adopt again the position that fostered my inner silence. I followed his command with unusual ease. Normally, I have been reluctant, perhaps not overtly, but I would have felt a twinge of reluctance nonetheless. I had a vague thought that by the time I sat down, I was already in a state of inner silence. My thoughts were no longer clear. I felt an impenetrable darkness surrounding me, making me feel as if I was falling asleep. My body was utterly motionless, either because I had no intention of setting up any commands to move, or because I couldn't formulate them. A moment later, I found myself with Don Juan walking in the Sonora Desert. I recognized the surroundings. I'd been there with him so many times that I had memorized every feature of it. It was the end of the day, and the light of the setting sun centered in me a mood of desperation. I walked automatically aware that I was feeling in my body sensations that were not accompanied by thoughts. I was not describing to myself my state of being. I wanted to tell this to Don Juan, but the desire to communicate my bodily sensations to him vanished in an instant. Don Juan said very slowly and in a low, grave voice that the dry riverbed on which we were walking was most appropriate place for our business at hand, and that I should sit on a small boulder alone while he went and sat on another boulder about 50 feet away. I didn't ask San Juan. I was ordinarily would have what I was supposed to do. I knew what I had to do. I heard then the rustling steps of people walking through the bushes that were sparsely scattered around. There wasn't enough moisture in the area to allow the heavy growth of underbush. Some sturdy bush grew there, with a space of perhaps 10 or 15 feet between them. I saw the two men approaching. They seemed to be local men, perhaps Iroquois Indians from one of the Iroquois towns in the vicinity. They came and stood by me. One of them nonchalantly asked me how I had been. I wanted to smile at him and laugh, but I couldn't. My face was extremely rigid, yet I was exuberant. I wanted to jump up and down, but I couldn't. I told him that I had been fine. Then I asked them who they were. I said to them that I didn't know them, and yet I sensed an extraordinarily familiar with them. One of the men said matter-of-factly that they were allies. I stared at them, trying to memorize their features, but their features changed. They seemed to mold themselves to the mood of my stare. No thoughts were involved. Everything was a matter of guided but visceral sensations. I stared at them long enough to erase the features completely, and finally I was facing two shiny blobs of luminosity that vibrated. The blobs of luminosity did not have boundaries. They seemed to sustain themselves cohesively from within. At times they became flat, wide, then they would take on a vertically again at the height of a man. Suddenly, I felt Don Juan's arm hooking my right arm and pulling me from the boulder. He said that it was time to go. The next moment, I was home. I was in his house again in central Mexico, more bewildered than ever. Today, you found inorganic awareness, and then you saw it as it really is, he said. Energy is the irreducible residue of everything. As far as we're concerned, to see energy directly is the bottom line for human beings. Perhaps there are other things beyond that, but they are not available to us. Don Juan asserted all this over and over, and every time he said it, his words seemed to solidify me more and more, to help me return to my normal state. I told Don Juan everything I witnessed, everything I had heard. Don Juan explained to me that I had succeeded that day in transforming the anthropomorphic shape of inorganic beings into their essence, impersonal energy aware of itself. You must realize, he said, that it is our cognition, which is the essence and interpretation system, that curtails our resources. Our interpretation system is what tells us what the parameters of our possibilities are. And since we have been using that system of interpretation all our lives, we cannot possibly dare to go against their dictums. Orbs, interdimensional beings. The energy of those inorganic beings pushes us, Don Juan went on, and we interpret that push as we may, depending on our mood. The most sober thing to do for a sorcerer is to relegate those entities to an abstract level. The fewer interpretations sorcerers make, the better off they are. From now on, he continued, whatever you are confronted with the strange sight of an apparition, hold your ground and gaze at it with an inflexible attitude. If it is an inorganic being, your interpretation of it will fall off like dead leaves. If nothing happens, it's just a chicken shit apparition of your mind, which is not your mind anyway. The clear view. For the first time in my life, I found myself in a total quandary as to how to behave in the world. The world around me had not changed. It definitely stemmed from a flaw in me. Don Juan's influence had, and all the activities stemming from the practices into which he had engaged me so deeply, were taking their toll on me and were causing me a serious incapacity to deal with my fellow man. I examined my problem and concluded that my flaw was my compulsion to measure everyone using Don Juan as a yardstick. Don Juan was, in my estimate, a being who lived his life professingly in every aspect of the term, meaning that every one of his acts, no matter how insignificant, counted. I was surrounded by people who believed that they were immortal beings who contracted themselves every step of the way. There were beings whose acts could never be accounted for. It was an unfair game. The cards were stacked against the people I encountered. I was accustomed to Don Juan's unalterable behavior, to his total lack of self-importance, and to the unfathomable scope of his intellect. Very few of the people I knew were even aware that there existed another pattern of behavior that fostered these qualities. Most of them knew only the behavioral pattern of self-reflection, which renders man weak and contorted. Consequently, I was having a very difficult time in my academic studies. I was losing sight of them. I tried desperately to find a rationale that would justify my academic endeavors. The only thing that came to my aid and gave me a connection, however flimsy, to academia was the recommendation that Don Juan had made to me once, that warrior travel should have a romance with knowledge, in whatever form knowledge was presented. He had defined the concept of warrior travelers, saying that it referred to sorcerers who, by being warriors, traveled in the dark sea of awareness. He had added that human beings were travelers of the dark sea of awareness, and that this earth was but a station on their journey for extraneous reasons, which he didn't care to divulge at the time. The travelers had interpreted their voyage. He said that human beings were caught in a sort of eddy, a current that went in circles, giving them the impression of moving, while they were, in essence, stationary. He maintained that sorcerers were the only opponents of whatever force kept human beings prisoners, and that by means of their discipline, sorcerers broke loose from their grips and continued their journey of awareness. While precipitated the final chaotic upheaval in my academic life was incapacity to focus my interest on topics of anthropological concern. That didn't mean a hoot to me, not because of their lack of appeal, but because they were mostly matters that were words and concepts had to be manipulated, as in a legal document, to obtain a given result that would establish precedents. It was argued that human knowledge is built in such a fashion, and that the effort of every individual was a building block in constructing a system of knowledge. The example was put to me was that of a legal system by which we live, and which of invaluable importance to us. However, my romantic notion at the time impeded me from conceiving of myself as a barrister of anthropology. I had brought lock, stock, and barrel the concept that anthropology should be the matrix of all human endeavor, or the measure of man. Don Juan, a consummate pragmatist, a true warrior traveler of the unknown, said that I was full of prunes. He said that if it didn't matter that the anthropological topics proposed to me were maneuvers of words and concepts, that were most important was exercise of discipline. It doesn't make any difference, he said to me one time, how good a reader you are and how many wonderful books you can read. What's important is that you have the discipline to read what you don't want to read. The crux of the sorcerer's exercise of going to school is in what you refuse, not in what you accept. I decided to take some time off from my studies and went to work in the art department of a company that made decals. My job engaged my efforts and thoughts to their fullest extent. My challenge was to carry out the task assigned to me as perfectly and rapidly as I could. To set up the decal sheets with the images to be processed by silk screening into decals was a standard procedure that wouldn't omit of any invocation, and the efficiency of the worker was measured by exactness and speed. I became a workaholic and enjoyed myself tremendously. The director of the art department and I became fast friends. He practically took me under his wing. His name was Ernest Lipton. I admired and respected him immensely. He was a fine artist and a magnificent craftsman. His flaw was his softness, his incredible consideration for others, which bordered on passivity. For example, one day we were driving out of the parking lot of a restaurant where we had eaten lunch. Very politely, he waited for another car to pull out of the parking space in front of him. The driver obviously didn't see us and began to back out at a considerable speed. Ernest Lipton could easily have blown his horn to attract the man's attention, to watch where he was going. Instead, he sat grinning like an idiot as the man crashed into the car. He then turned and apologized to me. Gee, I could have blown my horn, he said, but it's so effing loud, it embarrasses me. The guy who had backed up into Ernest's car was furious and had to be palisated. Don't worry, Ernest said. There's no damage to your car. Besides, you only smashed my headlights. I was going to replace them anyway. Another day in the same restaurant, some Japanese people, clients of the decal company and his guests for lunch, were talking animatedly to us, asking questions. The waiter came with the food and cleared the table of some of the salad plates, making room the best way he could on the narrow table for the huge hot plates of the entry. One of the Japanese clients needed more space. He pushed his plate forward and set Ernest's plate into motion, and it began to slide off the table. Again, Ernest could have warned the man, but didn't. He sat there grinning until the plate fell in his lap. Another occasion, I went to his house to help him put up some rafters over his patio, where he was going to let a grapevine grow for partial shade and fruit. He prearranged the rafters into a huge frame and then lifted one side and bolted it to some beams. Ernest was tall, very strong man, and using a length of 2x4s as hoisting device, he lifted the other end for me to fit the bolts into the holes that were already drilled into the supporting beams. But before I had the chance to put the bolts, there were an instant knock at the door, and Ernest asked me to see who it was while he held the frame of rafters. His wife is at the door with her grocery packages. She engaged me in a lengthy conversation, and I forgot about Ernest. I had even helped her to put the groceries away. In the middle of arranging her celery bundles, I remembered that my friend was still holding the frame of the rafters, and knowing him, I knew that he would still be at the job, expecting everybody else to have the consideration that he himself had. He rushed desperately to the backyard, and there he was on the ground. He had collapsed from exhaustion of holding the heavy wooden frame. He looked like a rag doll. We had to call his friends to lend a hand and hoist up the frame and rafters. He couldn't do it anymore. He had to go to bed. He thought for sure he had a hernia. The classic story about Ernest Lipton was that one day he went hiking for the weekend in San Bernardino Mountains with some friends. They camped in the mountains for the night. While everybody was sleeping, Ernest Lipton went to the bushes, and being such a considerate man, he walked some distance from the camp so as to not bother anybody. He slipped into darkness and rolled down the side of a mountain. He told his friends afterwards that he knew for a fact he was falling to his death at the bottom of the valley. He was lucky that he grabbed on a ledge with his tips of his fingers. He held on for it for hours, searching in the dark with his feet for any support, because his arms were about to give. He was going to hold on until his death. By extending his legs as wide as he could, he found a tiny protuberance in the rock that helped him to hold on. He stayed stuck to the rock like decals that he had made until there was enough light for him to realize he was only a foot from the ground. Ernest, you could have yelled for help, his friends commanded. Gee, I didn't think there was any use, he replied. Who could have helped me? Or heard me? I thought I had rolled down at least a mile into the valley. Besides, everyone was asleep. The final blow came for me when Ernest Lipton, who spent 2 hours daily commuting back and forth from his house to the shop, decided to buy an economy car, a Volkswagen Beetle, and began measuring how many miles per gallon of gasoline. I was extremely surprised when he announced one morning that he had reached 125 miles per gallon. Being a very exact man, he qualified his statements, saying that most of his driving was not done in the city but on the freeway, although at the peak hour of traffic he had to slow down and accelerate quite often. A week later, he said that he had reached 250 mile per hour mark. The marvelous event escalated until he reached an unbelievable figure, 645 miles to the gallon. His friends told him that he should enter the figure into a logs of the Volkswagen company. Ernest Lipton was pleased as punch and gloated, saying that he wouldn't know what to do if he reached the 1,000-mile mark. His friends told him that he should claim a miracle. This extraordinary situation went on until one morning when he caught one of his friends, who for months had been playing the oldest gag in the book on him, adding gasoline to his tank. Every morning he had been adding 3 or 4 cups so that Ernest's gas gauge would never drop. Ernest Lipton was nearly angry. His harshest comment was, "Gee, is that supposed to be funny?" I know for weeks his friends were playing the gag on him, but it was unable to intervene. I felt that it was none of my business, but the people who were playing the gag on Ernest Lipton were his lifelong friends. I was a newcomer. When I saw his look of disappointment and hurt, and his incapacity to get angry, I felt a wave of guilt and anxiety. I was facing again an old enemy of mine. I despised Ernest Lipton, and at the same time I liked him immensely. He was helpless. The real truth of the matter was that Ernest Lipton looked like my father. His thick glasses, his receding hairline, as well as the stubble of graying beard that he could never quite shave completely, brought my father's features to mind. He had the same straight pointed nose and pointed chin, but seeing Ernest Lipton's inability to get angry and punch the jokers in the nose was what really clinched his likeness to my father for me, and I pushed it beyond the threshold of safety. I remembered how my father had been madly in love with the sister of my best friend. I spotted her one day in a resort town holding hands with a young man. Her mother was with her as a chaperone. The girl seemed so happy. The two young people looked at each other, enraptured. As far as I could see, it was young love at its best. When I saw my father, I told him, relishing every instant of my recounting with all the malice of my 10 years, that his girlfriend had a real boyfriend. He was taken aback. He didn't believe me. But have you seen anything at all to that girl? I asked him daringly. Does she know that you're in love with her? Don't be stupid, you little creep. He snapped at me. I don't have to tell you any woman, any shit of that sort. Like a spoiled child, he looked at the protuberantly, his lips trembling with rage. She's mine. She should know that she's my woman without having to tell her anything. He declared all this with the certainty of a child who had everything in life given to him without having to fight for it. At the apex of my form, I delivered my punchline. While I said, I think she expected someone to tell her that, and someone has just beaten you to it. I was prepared to jump out of his reach and run because I thought he would slash at me with all the fury in the world. But instead, he crumpled down and began to weep. He asked me, sobbingly, uncontrollably, that since I was capable of anything, would I please spy on the girl for him and tell him what was going on. I despised my father beyond anything I could say, and at the same time I loved him with a sadness that was unmatched. I cursed myself for precipitating the shame on him. Ernest Lipton reminded me of my father so much that I quit my job, alleging that I had to go back to school. I didn't want to increase the burden that I already carried on my shoulders. I had never forgiven myself for causing my father that anguish, and I had never forgiven him for being such a coward. I went back to school and began the gigantic task of reintegrating myself into my studies of anthropology. What made this reintegration very difficult was the fact that if there were someone I could have worked with ease and delight because of his admirable touch, his daring curiosity, and his willingness to expand his knowledge without getting flustered or defending indefensible points, it was someone outside my department, an archaeologist. It was because of his influence that I had become interested in fieldwork in the first place. Perhaps because of the fact that he actually went into the field, literally to dig out information. His practicality was an oasis of sobriety for me. He was the only one who had entertained me to go ahead and to do field work because I had nothing to lose. Lose it all and you'll gain it all, he told me once, the soundest advice that I had ever gotten in academia. If I followed Don Juan's advice and worked toward correcting my obsession with self-reflection, I veritably had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But this possibility hadn't been in the cards for me that time. So true. When I told Don Juan about the difficulty I encountered in finding a professor to work with, I thought that his reaction to what I'd said was vicious. He called me a petty fart, and worse. He told me what I had already knew, that if I were not so tense, I could have worked successfully with anybody in academia or in business. Warrior travelers don't complain, Don Juan went on. They take everything that infinity hands them as a challenge. A challenge is a challenge. It isn't personal. It cannot be taken as a curse or a blessing. A warrior traveler neither wins the challenge or the challenge demolishes him. It's more exciting to win, so win. I told him that it was easy for anyone else to say that, but to carry it out was another matter. And with my tribulations were insoluble because they orientated in the incapacity of my fellow man to be consistent. It's not the person around you who are at fault, he said. They cannot help themselves. The fault is with you because you can help yourself, but you're bent on judging them at a deep level of silence. Any idiot can judge. If you judge them, you will only get the worst out of them. All of us human beings are prisoners. And it is that prison that makes us act in such a miserable way. Your challenge is to take people as they are. Leave people alone. You're absolutely wrong this time, Don Juan, I said. Believe me, I have no interest whatsoever in judging them or entangling myself with them in any way. You do understand what I'm talking about, he insisted doggedly. If you're not conscious of your desire to judge them, he continued, You are in even worse shape than I thought. This is the flaw of a warrior travelers. When they begin to resume their journeys, they get cocky out of hand. I admitted to Don Juan that my complaints were petty in the extreme. I knew that much. I said to him that I was confronted with daily events that had nefarious quality of wearing down all my resolve, and that I was embarrassed to relate to Don Juan the incident that weighed heavily on my mind. Come on, he urged me, out with it. Don't have any secrets from me. I'm an empty tube. Whatever you say to me will be projected out into infinity. All I have are miserable complaints, I said. I am exactly like all the people I know. There's no way to talk to a single one of them without hearing an overt or covert complaint. I related to Don Juan how even the simplest dialogues my friends managed to sneak in an endless number of complaints, such as dialogue like this one. How's everything, Jim? Oh, fine, Cal. I had a huge silence would follow them. I would be obliged to say, is there something wrong, Jim? No, everything's great. I have a bit of a problem with Mel, but you know how Mel is, selfish and shitty. But you have to take your friends as they come, true? He could, of course, had a little more consideration. But what the? He's himself. He always puts the burden on you. Take me or leave it. He's been doing that since we were 12. So it's really my fault. Why the do I have to take him? Well, you're right, Jim. You know Mel is very hard. Yes, yeah. Well, speaking of shitty people, you're no better than Mel, Cal. I can never count on you, except. Another classic dialogue was, how you doing, Alex? How's your married life? Oh, just great. For the first time, I'm eating on time. Home cooked meals. But I'm getting fat. There's nothing for me to do except watch TV. I used to go out with the guys, but now I can't. Teresa doesn't let me. Of course, I could tell her to go and herself, but I don't want to hurt her. I feel content but miserable. And Alex had the most miserable guy before he got married. He was the only one whose classic joke was to tell his friends every time he ran into him, hey, come to my car. I want to introduce you to my. He enjoyed himself pink with our crush expectations when he would see that what he had in his car was a female dog. He introduced his bitch to all his friends. We were shocked when he actually married Teresa, a long distance runner. They met at a marathon when Alex fainted. They were in the mountains and Teresa had to revive him by any means, so she pissed on his face. What? No. After that, Alex was her prisoner. She had marked her territory. His friends used to say, her pissy prisoner. His friends thought she was the true who had turned weird Alex into a fat dog. Don Juan had laughed for a while. Then he looked at me with a serious expression. These are the ups and downs of daily living, Don Juan said. You win and you lose, and you don't know when you win or when you lose. This is the price one pays for living under the rule of self-reflection. There is nothing that I can say to you, and there's nothing that you can say to yourself. I can only recommend that you not feel guilty because you're an asshole, but that you strive to end the dominion of self-reflection. Go back to school, don't give up yet. My interest in remaining in academia was wearing considerably. I began to live in automatic pilot. I felt heavy, despondent. However, I noticed that my mind was not evolved. I didn't calculate anything or set up any goals or expectations of any sort. My thoughts were not observed. My thoughts were not obsessive, but my feelings were. I try to conceptualize this dichotomy between a quiet mind and turbulent feelings. I was in this frame of mindlessness and overwhelmed feelings that I walked one day from Haynes Hall, where the anthropology department was, to the cafeteria to eat my lunch. I was suddenly accosted by a strange tremor. I thought I was going to faint, and I sat down on some brick steps. I saw yellow spots in front of my eyes. I had the sensation that I was spinning. I was sure that I was going to get sick to my stomach. My vision became blurry, and finally I couldn't see a thing. My physical discomfort was so total and intense that it didn't leave room for a single thought. I had only bodily sensations of fear and anxiety mixed with elation and strange anticipation that I was at the threshold of a gigantic event. They were sensations without a counterpart of thought. At a given moment, I no longer knew where I was or standing. I was surrounded by the most impenetrable darkness one can imagine, and then I saw energy as it flowed in the universe. I saw a succession of luminous spheres walking toward me or away from me. I saw them one at a time, as Don Juan had always told me one sees them. I knew they were different individuals because of their differences in size. I examined the details of their structures. Their luminosity and their roundedness were made of fibers that seemed to be stuck together. They were thin or thick fibers. Every one of those luminous figures had a thick, shaggy covering. They looked like some strange, luminous, furry animals or gigantic round insects covered with luminous hair. What was the most shocking thing to me was the realization that I had seen those furry insects all my life. Every occasion on which Don Juan had made me deliberately see them seemed to me at the moment to be like a detour that I had taken with him. I had remembered every instance of his help in making me see people as luminous spheres, and all of those instances were set apart from the bulk of seeing to which I was having access now. I knew then, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I had perceived energy as it flows in the universe all my life, on my own, without anybody's help. Such a realization was overcoming to me. I felt infinitely vulnerable, frail. I needed to seek cover, to hide somewhere. It was exactly like the dream that most of us seem to have at one time or another, in which we find ourselves naked and don't know what to do. I felt more than naked. I felt unprotected, weak, and I dreaded returning to my normal state. In a vague way, I sensed that I was lying down. I braced myself for my return to normality. I conceived of the idea that I was going to find myself laying on the brick wall, twitching convulsively, surrounded by a whole circle of spectators. The sensation that I was lying down became more and more extenuated. I felt that I could move my eyes. I could see light through my closed eyelids, but I dreaded opening them. The odd part was that I didn't hear any of those people that I imagined around me. I heard no voices at all. At least I ventured opening my eyes. I was on my bed in my office apartment by the corner of Wilshire and Westwood Boulevards. I became quite hysterical upon finding myself in my bed, but for some reason that was beyond my grasp. I calmed down almost immediately. My hysteria was replaced by a bodily indifference, or by a state of bodily satisfaction, something what one feels after a good meal. However, I could not quiet my mind. It had been the most shocking thing imaginable for me to realize that I had perceived energy directly all my life. How in the world could it have been possible that I had known? What had been preventing me from gaining access to the facet of my being? Don Juan had said that every human being has the potential to see energy directly. What he hadn't said was every human being already sees energy directly but doesn't know it. I put the question to my psychiatrist friend. He couldn't shed any light on my quandary. He thought that my reaction was a result of fatigue and overstimulation. He gave me a prescription for Valium and told me to rest. I hadn't dared mention to anyone that I had woke up in my bed without being able to account for how I had gotten there. Therefore, my haste to see Don Juan was more than justified. I flew to Mexico City as soon as I could, rented a car, and drove to where he lived. You've done all this before, Don Juan said, laughing, when I narrated my mind-boggling experience to him. There are only two things that are new. One, that now you have perceived energy all by yourself. What you did was stop the world. And then you realized that you had always seen energy as it flows in the universe, as every single human does, but without knowing it deliberately. The other new thing is that you have traveled from your inner silence all by yourself. You know, without having to tell you that anything is possible if one departs from inner silence. This time your friend and vulnerability made it possible for you to end up in your bed, which is not really that far from UCLA campus. If you would not indulge in your surprise, you would realize that what you did is nothing extraordinary for a warrior traveler. But the issue, which is of the current utmost importance, isn't knowing that you have always perceived energy directly, or you're journeying from inner silence, but rather a twofold affair. First, you experience something which the sorcerers of ancient Mexico called the clear view, or losing the human form. The time when human pettiness vanishes, as if it had been a patch of fog looming over us, a fog that slowly clears up and dissipates, but under no circumstances must you believe that this is an accomplished fact. The sorcerer's world is not an immutable world, like the world of everyday life, where they tell you that once you reach a goal, you remain a winner forever. In the sorcerer's world, to arrive at a certain goal means that you have simply acquired the most efficient tools to continue your fight, which, by the way, will never end. The second part of this twofold matter is that you experience the most maddening question for the hearts of human beings. You express it yourself when you ask yourself the questions: how in the world could I have been possible that I didn't know that I had perceived energy directly all my life? What had been preventing me from gaining access to the facet of my being? And there, my friends, we're going to end for today's reading of The Active Side of Infinity. So some things to take away from: have you seen energy? I know I have. There are people who see orbs, who see light energy, who could see aura, who could see human biofields. There's a lot people can see. A lot kitties can see too. Write in the comments, have you seen any of those things? Have you had teleportation? We read about that the other day in Urantia. Well, in Convoluted Universe. And Elena Denon did a fabulous interview, though it is in French, but there's subtitles below, with John Charles Moyen. Urge you to watch that. Amazing interview. And I cried. Pretty much. I cried. It's very interesting when you talk about ghosts and apparitions, and people see the dark shadows that interlace in between me all the time. I see a lot of things out of the sides and corners out of my eyes, and then I have to double check on what world I'm in. It's very interesting. If you have experienced that, let me know. I'd love to hear it. It's an incredible book. And I'm trying to not curse as the book wants you to curse. Sending each and every one of you love and light. I hope you have an amazing day, and I will see you on the next one. Stay tuned. I got some good stuff coming too. Bye, guys.